My name is Alexandra Chen, but everyone calls me Alex. For the past 3 years, I've worked as a receptionist at Elite Motors, Miami's most prestigious Ferrari dealership. But what my boss, Richard Sterling, never knew was that I was far more than the woman answering his phones. The morning everything changed started like any other. I arrived early at 7:30 a.m., the Miami sun already blazing across the gleaming rows of Ferraris outside. Each car was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The dealership itself was stunning, walls of glass and sweeping curves designed to show off the multi-million-dollar machines inside. I straightened my simple black blazer before unlocking the front doors. The familiar scent of leather and new car interiors greeted me. "Morning, Alex," Marco called from the service bay as he carefully rolled a Ferrari F8 Tributo into position. "Any chance you can get those overtime forms processed today? The guys keep asking about last month's holiday weekend." I grimaced slightly, thinking about the stack of overtime requests still sitting in Richard Sterling's inbox. "I'll try again at the morning meeting," I promised. The service team had worked through Memorial Day weekend for a special event, but Richard had been too busy, or too uninterested, to approve their extra pay. It had been 3 weeks. What no one at Elite Motors knew, not Richard, not the flashy sales team with their matching Rolex watches, not even kind-hearted Marco, was that I had a very personal reason to care about how this dealership was run. The truth was hidden behind layers of holding companies and real estate trusts. I owned the land the dealership sat on. All 5 acres of prime Miami commercial property. It had been my grandfather's last gift to me before he passed away 3 years ago. "Property is power, little one," he told me from his hospital bed, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. "But knowledge, knowing when to reveal your power, that's everything." So I followed his advice. Instead of announcing myself as the landlord, I took a job at Elite Motors as a receptionist. I wanted to learn the business from the ground up. And for 3 years I watched. I had an MBA from Wharton and enough family money that I never needed to work again. But my grandfather had always believed the best way to understand a business was to see every level of it. What I learned about Richard Sterling over those 3 years made my blood boil. The morning meeting started at exactly 9 a.m. in the dealership's glass-walled conference room. Richard arrived last as usual, wearing a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit. "Let's make this quick," he said, not even bothering to sit down. "Sales numbers last month were decent, but we can do better. Jenkins, your team needs to push the F8s harder. Too many sitting on the lot." I cleared my throat softly. "Mr. Sterling, about the service team's overtime forms." "Not now, Alex," he interrupted without even looking at me. "Sir, they've been waiting 3 weeks and legally." Richard finally turned toward me. His face twisted into the familiar smirk I had come to hate. And my hand tightened around my notebook. "Look," Richard said, leaning back in his chair, "if you're so concerned about a few hours of overtime, maybe you should find a job more suited to your abilities. Answering phones can't be that demanding." The conference room went silent. Behind me I could feel Marco stiffen. Across the table, Jenkins and the other salespeople suddenly became very interested in their phones. "After all," Richard continued, enjoying the attention, "it's not like you contribute anything meaningful here. You're just a receptionist. Frankly, a pretty worthless one if you can't figure out when to keep quiet." For a moment no one spoke. Instead of anger, a strange calm settled over me. 3 years of watching Richard bully employees, ignore regulations and cut corners had led to this moment. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. "Knowledge is knowing when to reveal your power." "You're absolutely right, Mr. Sterling," I said quietly as I reached into my bag. "I am just a receptionist." I pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed several documents on the polished conference table. "But there's something you should see." Richard barely glanced at the papers. "This," I said, sliding the first document toward him, "is the deed to the land Elite Motors sits on. And these are the property tax records for the past 3 years." He frowned. "What's your point?" "The dealership has a long-term lease with some investment group. Chen Holdings or something." "Chen Real Estate Trust," I corrected calmly. "Founded by my grandfather 30 years ago." I let the words settle. I inherited it when he passed away 3 years ago. Right before I started working here. The color slowly drained from Richard's face. I placed another stack of documents on the table. I also have a complete record of every regulatory violation committed since you took over this dealership. Every falsified emissions test. Every illegal markup. Every instance of denied overtime. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioner humming. The Ferrari corporate office might find these interesting, I added. They tend to take their brand reputation very seriously. Richard's face flushed red. You're bluffing, he snapped. You can't. I can, I interrupted calmly. And I will. I straightened my blazer and stood. The lease agreement contains several clauses regarding regulatory compliance and ethical business practices. Clauses you've violated repeatedly. I met his eyes. You have until Monday morning to resign as owner and transfer your controlling shares to the employee trust I've established. Someone gasped behind me. If you refuse, I continued, I will terminate the lease, notify Ferrari Corporate, and report the overtime violations to the Department of Labor. I paused at the door. I'm sure the Miami Herald would love the story as well. The conference room exploded into shocked voices as I walked out. Marco caught up with me at the reception desk a minute later. 3 years, he said, shaking his head. You worked this front desk for 3 years, dealing with his abuse, while you own the entire property? I smiled faintly, thinking of my grandfather. I needed to understand the business from every angle, I said. Its value. Its problems. Its people. I picked up the stack of overtime forms. Speaking of which, I added, let's get these processed. I think you'll find the new ownership much more reliable with payroll. An hour later, Richard stormed out of the dealership, his face purple with rage. He tried to take the Ferrari he'd been using as his personal car, but Marco had already switched the keys. The car belongs to the dealership, I called after him as he stood fuming in the parking lot. But don't worry, I added calmly. I called you an Uber. We wouldn't want to be worthless hosts. His ride pulled away a few minutes later. I sat at the reception desk one last time and began typing an email to Ferrari's corporate office. By Monday morning, Elite Motors would have new ownership, new management, and a very different way of doing business. First, I had some overtime forms to process. The weekend after my confrontation with Richard was anything but quiet. By Friday evening, my phone was already buzzing with calls from Ferrari's corporate office in Italy. I sat in what had been Richard's office, now mine, speaking fluent Italian with their executives and explaining the situation at Elite Motors. Ms. Chen, the vice president of North American operations, said after switching to English, "We've been concerned about Sterling's management for some time. Unfortunately, we never had concrete evidence." I glanced at the thick folders on the desk in front of me. "Now you do," I said calmly. "You say you have documentation?" "Complete records," I confirmed, glancing at the files I had spent 3 years quietly collecting. Inside were detailed reports of unauthorized markups on limited edition models, falsified service records, and customer complaints that had been buried instead of resolved. There was a brief pause on the line. "And you gathered all of this while working as a receptionist?" I smiled, remembering my grandfather's advice. "The best way to understand a business is from the front desk," I said. "You see everything. You hear everything. And if you're patient enough, you can document everything." The Ferrari executive chuckled softly. "Your grandfather taught you well. Chen Holdings has been a respected name in Asian business circles for decades. We would be very interested in continuing our relationship with Elite Motors under your leadership." By Sunday night, everything was set in motion. Richard had been given a simple choice: resign quietly or face legal consequences that would destroy his career. In the end, he signed over his controlling shares to the employee trust one had created. His final act was a dramatic email to the staff, claiming he was the victim of corporate espionage. I forwarded it to our lawyers without a single comment. Monday morning, I arrived early as usual, but not to sit at the reception desk. Instead, I gathered the entire staff in the showroom before opening. 60 employees stood around the display floor, their eyes fixed on me as I stood beside our flagship Ferrari SF90 Straight Ale. "I know many of you have questions about what happened on Friday," I began, "and about what happens next." The room was silent. Let me be clear. Elite Motors isn't just changing ownership. We're changing how we do business. I nodded toward Marco, our head mechanic. "First, All outstanding overtime has been processed. The payments will be in your accounts by noon. A cheer broke out from the service team. Second, I continued, we're implementing a profit-sharing program. Every employee, sales, service, and support staff will now have equity in the dealership's success. Jenkins, our top salesman, raised his hand. Ms. Chen, Alex, what about sales targets? Under Mr. Sterling the pressure was intense. And unethical, I finished calmly. That ends today. I stepped forward slightly. We're moving to a customer-focused model. No pushing cars on people who can't afford them. No hidden fees. No illegal markups. Ferrari chose this dealership to represent excellence, not exploitation. I could see tension leaving people's shoulders, replaced with cautious optimism. But make no mistake, I added. I still expect excellence. We are going to become the most prestigious and most ethical Ferrari dealership in North America. Not by cutting corners. By doing things right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I hired consultants to modernize our systems, introduced new customer service protocols, and personally reviewed every open sale to ensure it met our new standards. Several customers received refund checks for unauthorized markups, along with invitations to a private client appreciation event. The transition wasn't perfect. 2 salespeople quit rather than follow the new rules. A few of Richard's friends in the luxury car industry tried to spread rumors. But the results spoke for themselves. Within a month, customer satisfaction scores had soared. The service department's efficiency improved by 40% once they finally had proper staffing and resources. And sales? They actually increased. It turned out that honesty and respect created more referrals than pressure and manipulation ever could. 6 weeks after the takeover, I was working late in my office when Marco knocked on the door. Got a minute, boss? He asked, holding a folder. Always, I said, gesturing to the chair. And please, it's still Alex. He sat down, shaking his head with a grin. I still can't believe you spent 3 years answering phones when you owned the entire place. Best education I could have gotten, I replied. It showed me who the real heroes were. Like a certain service team that stayed late every weekend to make sure customers' cars were perfect, even when they weren't being paid overtime. Marco laughed. Well, speaking of that, he opened the folder. Inside were detailed service records. Remember that SF90 Richard could never fix? The one with the electrical problem. I nodded. It had been a constant headache. With the new diagnostic equipment you approved, and enough time to properly test it, we finally solved it. He handed me the report. Permanent fix. I looked over the documentation and smiled. Excellent work, I said, genuinely impressed. Make sure the customer receives a detailed report, I said, handing the folder back to Marco. And comp their next service as an apology for the wait. Marco nodded and stood up, but before leaving he paused at the door. You know what the guys in service were talking about? He said with a small smile. Richard used to call us worthless grease monkeys. Called you worthless too. He shook his head. Funny how the worthless people turned out to be the ones who actually knew how to run this place. After he left, I walked out into the showroom. The evening sun poured through the glass walls, painting the Ferraris in shades of gold and crimson. Their sleek curves reflected the Miami sunset like polished mirrors. Back in my office, a framed photo of my grandfather sat on the desk. In it, he stood proudly in front of his first real estate purchase, wearing old overalls after spending the day working alongside his maintenance crew. Property is power, he used to say. But knowledge, knowing when to reveal your power, that's everything. Over the years, I'd added my own lesson to his wisdom. True power isn't about humiliating others or proving your superiority. It's about building something meaningful, something that lifts everyone up. Under Richard, Elite Motors had been a monument to one man's ego. Now it was becoming something far more valuable. A business where excellence and ethics worked hand in hand. Richard's worthless receptionist had turned out to be the owner he never saw coming. But more importantly, she had transformed his dealership into the success he could never achieve, simply by valuing the people he had dismissed. The next morning, a familiar face walked into the showroom. Richard's former assistant. She had quit months earlier after enduring one too many of his outbursts. I heard things have changed, she said hesitantly. They have, I replied with a smile. Very much. Lisa had always been kind to me when I was just the receptionist. In fact, I continued, we're looking for a new customer relations manager. Someone who knows our clients and understands the importance of treating people with respect. Her eyes widened. Really? But I don't have a fancy degree. You have something better, I said gently. Experience, integrity, and a clear understanding of how people shouldn't be treated. She hesitated for only a moment. When can I start? As I showed her around the dealership and her new office, our reflections appeared in the showroom glass. Two women Richard had once called worthless, now helping run one of the most successful Ferrari dealerships in the country. The irony was satisfying, but proving him wrong was never the real goal. The real victory was proving ourselves right. 3 months after the takeover, Ferrari's corporate office sent a team to evaluate our operations. They spent a full week reviewing every part of the business: sales performance, service quality, employee satisfaction, and customer feedback. Their final report was glowing. One line in particular made me smile. Elite Motors represents the perfect fusion of excellence and ethics. Ms. Chen's innovative leadership, combining operational knowledge with employee empowerment and customer respect, sets a new standard for luxury automotive retail. I had the report framed and hung in the break room, right next to our new mission statement. Excellence is not what we do, it's who we are. Richard's name slowly faded from Miami's luxury car scene. But Elite Motors thrived. The employee trust continued to grow in value, creating wealth not just for salespeople, but for every person who contributed to the dealership's success. The worthless receptionist had turned a toxic workplace into a model of ethical business. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the showroom closes, I still sit at the reception desk for a few minutes. It reminds me of those 3 years, watching, learning, and planning. But more than anything, it reminds me that true worth isn't defined by titles or power. It's defined by what you build, how you treat people, and the legacy you leave behind. As for the overtime paperwork that started it all, now it's processed automatically every Friday, with bonuses for exceptional service. Because in a business built on excellence, no contribution is ever worthless. The story of Elite Motors spread through the luxury car world. A quiet lesson about the danger of underestimating people, and the power of patient, principled leadership. Richard sometimes drives past the dealership in his leased BMW, slowing for a moment as he looks at the gleaming showroom that used to be his. But he never stops. After all, his Uber rating still isn't quite up to our standards.